to the Think-N-Innovate podcast. Today's episode is a treat for anyone passionate about reimagining education. Joining us is a leader who has made waves across continents, blending innovation with deep experience. Dr. Neil Hopkin, Director of Education at Fortis Education. From the UK to Singapore, China, and now in Dubai, Dr. Hopkin has been on a global journey, transforming education with his unique vision. We are thrilled to have him here to dive into the world of innovative pedagogy, school system redesign, and what the future of education might hold. But let's not forget, Dr. Hopkin also has a fantastic sense of humor, so we are in for some laughs too. Dr. Hopkin, let's go back in time. What was little Neil Hopkin like as a student?
Much thinner than he is now. Both of my parents were teachers. So I suppose I was conscientious about what I thought school meant and how important it was to behave well. And my dad was a thoughtful man. He'd got his degree at night school. Nobody in my family had ever gone to university. So I suppose he was the most academic person that I knew. I come from a long line of bricklayers and house builders, a very working class background, really. And so school for me was an opportunity to explore ideas and to explore my intellect. I was naturally very curious, extremely talkative, nothing has changed there. And so I think, and I had a very lively imagination. I've always lived in my head, a very vivid imagination. And so I think that the small Neil Hopkin was that child that lived in this fantasy world, acted most of his way through his days, different voices, different personas, different characters. I was a very happy child. I had a very happy home life. My parents took very good care of me, and it was full of love. So I was very settled. I wasn't particularly industrious. I didn't really settle to work. I did, when I was 16, I took my GCSEs in the UK. They were called O-levels back in the day. I hardly did any revision. I didn't perform particularly well. And looking back, I can say I completely underperformed in terms of my ability range. But I remained happy nonetheless. So yeah, I was probably an underachiever, but a happy one.
Wonderful. So teaching is in your blood, as you said, your parents are both
It
from
was
the
very
education
definitely
field.
in my blood. I fought against it. I didn't want to be a teacher, and no doubt we'll unpack that a little bit more later. But it was certainly, I grew up at my mother's knee, literally, in her classroom. If my school was closed and her school was open, then I had to go to her school for the day. So yeah, it was in the blood.
Was there any teacher who has left a lasting impact on you?
Yeah, very much so. Instantly. I often, when I'm talking with groups of school leaders and teachers, I often talk about tell me that teacher that you remember. And everybody remembers that teacher. I do. His name was Ken Orchard. I remember him particularly because I was in what we now call Year 5 in the UK system. In my school, we would sit on the stage. We had to sing songs in assembly at the beginning of the morning. We had a little book that the words for the songs would be in. And I can remember the most feared teacher in the school was a guy called Sid Pyfinch. And in the UK, after the Second World War, returning servicemen and women, if they wanted a job in education, they were given one. It was a way of getting them back into the workforce after the end of the war. And Sid Pyfinch was in the RAF, and he joined as a primary school teacher. I have no idea why, because he clearly hated children, or he certainly appeared to. And he was in a class he was leading the Year 6 class. Ironically, sat just in front of me. I was on a stage in Ken Orchard's class. And one of the kids in his class had got a slightly damaged book of songs. So Sid Pyfinch came wading into this line of little kids just sat there, snatched this book out of this child's hand and whacked him across the back of the head and roared at him for the state of his book. I nearly wet myself because the week before I'd lost my book completely.
Okay.
And anyway, I worried about it. I talked with my parents about it for weeks on end. I was really fearful of being discovered by Mr. Piefinch that I hadn't got this book, and we couldn't find a book anywhere. And on one particular occasion, I was reading. You had to every week you would have to read to your teacher, and I was standing next to Ken Orchard's desk and reading, and I suddenly broke down in tears, which was not at all typical for me. I wasn't that child. I was very settled and calm and happy. I broke down in tears, and he said to me, "Whatever's the matter, Neil?" And I said, "Well, it's banging. It's terrible. I've lost mine." And he said, "I can solve that for you." And he stood up, went over to his cupboard and got a new book. There it all was. All that time, all these new books had been in his cupboard. I didn't know. Yeah. And he solved it for me there and then. But he listened to me and instantly understood this was something that was traumatic. There was no problem with him saying, "Well, why have you lost it and where did it go? And you must take better care." He just understood that I needed that. Now, he also, I used to spend a lot of time drawing pictures of various birds of prey. It was my passion when I was sort of 9 or 10, sellotaping bits of paper together and drawing these birds. And I used to take one a week in to Mr. Orchard to present it to him. And he would always pin it on the wall, and there'd be a moment in the week when all the class would admire the latest picture I'd drawn and felt tipped in and so on. So he was just a lovely, lovely man. Now, the interesting thing was that I then decided many decades later, I was leading a school in China, and a Chinese magazine asked me the same question. Who's that teacher that you remember? I said it was Ken Orchard, and I delivered the story of Ken Orchard, and they published this thing in a magazine. So I sent a copy of it home to my mum, who's in her 80s, and she knew where Ken Orchard, who was in his 90s, was living, and she took it round to Ken Orchard. She shared this thing with him. Of course, I told the story about how this wonderful man, but now I am a big sort of globe-trotting school principal. And he said, "I remember Neil well. I always knew that he was going to go on to great things." Now, I have no idea if he did remember me at all, but he certainly said that to my mum. Okay. And I just think it was beautiful for me to have the opportunity to close the circle with gratitude. And for him in his 90s to hear that an act that he did that he categorically won't remember at all is something that has stayed with me for over 50 years, and that I still remember it as a pivotal moment in my understanding of what it meant to be a caring person. Never mind a teacher, just a caring person that listens to other people. So Ken Orchard will forever be burnt into my heart as a wonderful person and a great role model for what it means to be a teacher.
That's so kind. This is how the teachers are like.
That's it. I often say to teachers now, I say, be that person. In 20 or 30 years' time, when you're on a conference somewhere and somebody says, everyone remembers that teacher, and who is it that you remember? You want one of the children that you've taught today in 20 years' time to be saying, "Aha, yes, it's Mr. Smith, I remember him." And you're in the conference and you hear them mention it. You want to be that person that made a difference to children.
Did you ever see yourself in education, or were there any dreams along the way?
There were many dreams along the way, and many cul-de-sacs and roads that it didn't lead anywhere. I didn't dream of being in education at all. In fact, I dreamt the opposite. Okay. I didn't want to be in education. Both of my parents were teachers, as I said, and nobody wants to grow up to be their, well, certainly within British culture, nobody wants to grow up to be their parents. That's the last thing you want to do. Okay. You want to evolve and grow up to something else. Of course, the grandchildren want to grow up to be the parents because they don't want to grow up to be you. But so I certainly didn't want to be a teacher, and I left school at 16, having not performed particularly well in my GCSEs, and I got an apprenticeship as a microelectronics engineer and then a software designer, so I became a C++ programmer. Oh. And I enjoyed that a lot, but it just wasn't right for me. It wasn't the right fix. And eventually I woke up to the idea. I looked at everything else I was doing. I was very into sports and had been throughout most of my childhood and early adulthood. And I was in the England karate squad and was very full of passion for sport. But actually, when I looked at what I was doing with sport, most of the time I was teaching. I was teaching other people, and I enjoyed the teaching of karate. And so what it meant to me was when I stopped and said, why am I doing this tech career, which I'm competent at it, but I didn't feel passionate about it. Why am I still in this sphere 10 years on? I should be trying to find my passion. Well, I look back and I decided I've been fighting against becoming my dad, but as it is, I put weight on, I've lost all my hair, I've become my dad anyway. Why don't I go the whole hog and actually look at teaching more seriously? And as soon as I started down that avenue, I discovered that I should always have been doing this. This is the right thing for me. Although that's not quite right. I shouldn't always have been doing it. The experiences I had in that period of time, the 10 years, 13 years before I went into teaching, they were critically important for me, and they shaped a lot of what I've thought afterwards. But I think I just needed to be ready. It's all about readiness, isn't it? In that way, Piaget was right. In many ways, I think Piaget was wrong. But in that way, Piaget was right, that there's a readiness to learn. And there's equally a readiness for particular phases of your career. And by the time I was in my late 20s and 30, I was ready to make that move into teaching. Before that, I still had some experience and probably maturing to do to leave me in a position to be a much better teacher.
And were you ever up to any mischief that you remember and always on your best behavior?
Well, generally in life, I've always been up to mischief. I think that's very important. I think it's very important to be up to mischief and retain that sense of fun. I always try to be on my best behavior. I think it's important to be a good person. And not everybody is. And not everybody is driven to be that. But I think it's important to do the right thing. I mean, that's a tricky notion, isn't it? Because what's right to one person might be wrong to another. But I think it's important to be self-aware and to be reflective and to be consciously trying to be a good person, however you define that. And when I was a child at school, I was definitely trying to be well-behaved. I knew what it meant to be polite. My parents were very polite. My father was a gentleman as well as a gentleman. And those were qualities that I really admired and still do about him as I think back to him. And so that was something that I wanted to emulate as best I could. And I still try to do that.
Dr. Hopkin, you had an incredibly rich experience, right? And it's clear that education is not just a job for you.
No.
It's a calling, right?
It is.
Could you start telling us what was first drew you into the world of education?
Well, I think, as I say, I think it was really, I looked at the experiences that I was having and understood that actually, without ever planning it that way, I was teaching a lot of the time. But I think deeper than that, what was it that appealed to me about being involved in teaching and learning? I've always been a curious person. I can remember in conversations with my dad as a child, I used to hold up the spoon at the dining table and say, why when I look at my reflection, is it one way up when I have the spoon this way, and when I turn it round, the reflection is the other way up? Why is that? And my dad said, well, it's very complex, Neil. It's to do with mirrors and convex and concave mirrors. And it's you're a little bit too young. And then as I got older, he would say, well, when it's in the curriculum, when you get to your GCSE year, because he was a physics teacher, he was my physics teacher.
Okay.
He said, I'll teach you then. By the time I got to GCSE, they'd taken it out of the curriculum, so he never taught me. So I got to 16 and said to my dad, you still haven't told me why is this? And he said, I think you're old enough to figure it out yourself now. So I think there was something about my journey that had always been filled with curiosity. I remain a very curious person. I'm interested in meeting new people that are interesting, have different perspectives to me, different knowledge sets, and still in my professional career. Now I'm a director of education. I'm not a principal of school anymore. I've moved beyond that and so into a more commercial realm. I find that very interesting because I'm learning a lot. And so I believe in the notion of a lifelong learner. And I think what drew me to education was that sense of starting that journey of lifelong learning. I'm at the other end of the life now, but I'm still trying to learn. But I think that's probably what got me into it.
Yeah, there is no age of learning.
There is
should
no
never
limit
end.
to it. Exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
With all the school improvement projects and development plans you have championed, I have to ask. So do you think any of them could have viral on TikTok? Is there any moment that you would like to share?
Is there anything that would go viral on TikTok? I don't know. I mean, I suppose to answer that question, it would rather depend on what it is that makes something viral on TikTok. And I think I would want to start there. If I was seriously thinking, could something have gone viral? I would start with what is it that makes something viral on TikTok? You have to. We understand that that attention spans are very short. That people need to be hooked in. It needs to be something which is, to use that modern word, relatable. People have got to understand that this is going to be meaningful for them. So I think if I was looking for something meaningful and around innovation, I probably would have looked at something which was around mental health and social well-being. I think that's where a lot of people's concerns are shifting nowadays. And in terms of innovation there, it probably would have been something simple, not something technical. It probably would have been something around children's ability to articulate their feelings. I used to do when I first started teaching. I was in Kew, a tiny little village near Richmond upon Thames in London, and I used to do a lot of acting with the children. I was very keen on singing and acting and children composing music. And I suppose if anything was going to be viral, I mean, back in the day there was no viral, but if anything was going to be viral, it probably would have been something around those performances. I've always been passionate about the performing arts, and so we would often reword songs and sing. Now, I remember once I'd taken the children to the Natural History Museum in London, and the train broke down. And so I had all my children with me on the train, and they just burst into song, just naturally. And the whole, almost, the whole carriage was captivated, because these were little 9-year-old children singing beautifully, and tunes that everybody knew, but with different words, because it was around the shows and things that we were performing. And it was just beautiful. Those kind of moments would have been viral. I think when you have human connection, when there's something that, if that's what makes something viral on TikTok, then when you actually are living in the moment and there's a human connection between the people that you can see, that's the kind of thing that other people can latch onto and say, wow, that was a moment, and they like to look at it.
Yes, absolutely. You have worked in various countries, from the UK to Singapore to China,
yep.
and now in Dubai.
Yes.
Was there any pivotal moment in your early years as a principal that really shaped your approach to leadership?
Oh yes, completely, and it's very clear to me. So I was in the UK. It was in my first headship at school, and I received a visit from a great guy called Richard Hunter, who was head of it was a primary school, an elementary school. And he was head of an organisation, the primary wing of an organisation called the Specialist School and Academies Trust, the SSAT. Mm-hmm. And it was an alternative to the government's organisation, the Department for Education. So this was a buy schools, for schools movement, and every secondary school in the country, 20,000 schools, were all part of the SSAT. And there was an emerging wing of primary schools, probably about 1,000 that were there. He came to visit me in my first headship and said, look, Neil, I've heard that you're doing amazing things around new technologies. I don't think we were doing particularly amazing things, but we were probably ahead of the curve of most schools. And he said, I'd like to invite you to join our national steering group. So I agreed with delight. And I can remember the first meeting. I went into this room, and there was a conference table with probably about 10 people sat around it, who were the great and the good of British education. And I walked in as a early 30s, first headship guy, thinking, I don't belong in this room. These people know so much more than I do. I mean, they were the great names of a great period of British education. And they were all pretty much my age now, sort of late 50s. And I came in as this little whippersnapper, knowing nothing, and sat down very nervously and joined in with this group. And over the course of 3 or 4 years, they taught me everything that I needed for a lifetime of school leadership. They were incredibly generous and kind. And they just took me under their wing. There was no pretension, there was no ego, there was no who's this young upstart. There was no patronizing attitude. They encouraged everything that I did and praised everything I did. And did wonderful things with me. Dave Broadfield, one of these guys, who was, I think, probably the best head of new technologies the UK's ever had. He brought me onto his program where we advise schools around the country as part of the UK's Building Schools of the Future program. So we were helping design schools from down on the south of the country right up to the very north. I mean, incredible experiences that there was no way I would have got had it not been for their generosity and kindness. And that informed me about one thing about what it is to be a great leader, that you should be generous, you should be kind, nurture those young people that are coming through, because one day you will be the older person, you know, and support them, because they'll contribute things and they'll make you see the world differently.
And it must have been fascinating to experience such different educational culture.
Yes.
How did working in these diverse environment influence your approach to school leadership?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it's very different. Singapore was very different to Shanghai, where I was in China. Even though you might think Southeast Asia, East Asia, they'll be very similar. The mindsets maybe between Singaporeans and the Shanghainese similar, but actually not at all. Very different and completely different again to Dubai. I mean, what I found in Singapore was that there's very direct, straight lines of thinking. And Singaporean school setup, the Singaporean government, is very clear that the quality of education that it offers in its state schools is about as fine as you can get anywhere. Now, that's very different to most other countries in the world. What you tend to find in most other jurisdictions is the other way around, that the privately funded, in the UK what's called an independent school, is completely different in quality. It's higher in quality compared to the state school in most jurisdictions. But in Singapore, it's the other way around. And so there's not a massive amount of interest in what the international schools are doing, because, but the comparison is the world's finest. So, you guys knock yourself out. We're letting you deal with the expat community. So that was very interesting, because it actually gave you an incredible amount of freedom in an international school, whilst at the same time you're surrounded in this environment which is just imbued with this massive emphasis on education and self-improvement. And so it's probably the perfect environment. Some of the finest teaching that and in terms of school improvement and school development that I ever witnessed was in my school in Singapore. I had the most amazing senior leadership team. I had 3, maybe 4 deputy heads who were astonishingly good. And we just romped through some amazing initiatives and improvements to what we were doing. And that freedom was great. In Shanghai, it's very different. And so, huge country, different cultural setup. And many of the expats there felt quite isolated. And in some respects, certainly in contrast to Singapore, in some respects, if you were an English language medium expat, then much of China at that time was relatively difficult to penetrate. And so it meant that the school itself became much more of a focus. It was a microcosm of society, as opposed to Singapore, where you were in a land where everybody was invested in education. In Shanghai, it was very much the school community, and that changes everything. It changes everything in terms of mindset and whether or not there's more adventure or less adventure in terms of what you're trying to achieve. And so that was very interesting. And then here in Dubai, we've probably got the most thoroughly thought through regulatory framework that is anywhere in the world. I think many countries across the globe look to the KHDA and to the inspection framework of the DSIB with envy, because it's very, very well thought through and it's extremely thorough. And so here you've got a very strong regulatory system that ensures that all of these schools move en masse towards that outstanding output that the government seeks. So that, again, is a very interesting experience to have as a school leader, to experience what would you do if you were the government and you were trying to get everybody up to a certain level, absolutely everybody up to that certain level. And I think intellectually it's interesting to contrast that with Finland's approach, which actually has got rid of most regulation and doesn't do the same thing. Singapore's approach, who has this dual model and so on. And I think that the KHJ here has been very wise in looking at various different models and chosen this framework. So yes, it's been very interesting to contrast the different versions I see of it all.
Moving through different time zone, I imagine your teaching strategies must be, jet lag proof.
Yes,
Isn't it?
it is. It is interesting moving globally. I mean, I can remember one occasion. This is one that lives long in my memory. I remember one occasion getting a phone call from somebody who said, "Hey Neil, how are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, great. I haven't heard from you for a while. How are you? We're great. Where are you?" And I said where I was, which was nowhere near where they were.
Okay.
And they said, "Oh dear, because we've got 500 people in an auditorium waiting to listen to you right now." And I jet lag had got the better of me. I was in the wrong country, and I made a mess of my diary, and I wasn't able to get to that talk. So there are moments when traveling around a lot can be problematic, but nowadays I have a brilliant executive assistant who makes sure that kind of mishap never happens. But back in the day, it wasn't quite like that.
I remember how she has managed so nicely our appointment
Yes,
for the
indeed,
podcast
yes.
today.
Yeah.
One of your speciality is innovative pedagogy, especially around personalized and independent learning.
Yes.
Could you describe what it looks like a practical setting?
Yeah, well, it takes many different forms, I think. It can take many different forms, and that's good. It's good that there's flexibility to it, and you and I could implement it differently, and the team could implement it differently. I think. So, what does independent learning really mean? I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to empower children so that they take control of their learning. They feel that they're able to direct the experience to a great extent, and also that they're self-aware of what the learning outcomes are that you're trying to achieve. So look, we've got to learn these things. These are skills you need to acquire. This is knowledge you've got to understand. This is a level of understanding of how to apply it that we want to see demonstrated. So that they can actually chart their progress towards those end goals. I don't think that independent learning, personalized learning, project-based learning, negotiated learning, design thinking learning, whatever you might want to call it, I don't think it's great if it's just a free-for-all for the children. That children are children, and adults have a role to protect and nurture children, not restrict them and not put glass ceilings on them, and not jam-pack them so tightly they feel like sardines in a tin and you're just on a factory conveyor belt of learning. But at the same time, I don't think it should be just anything goes, because they would lose the benefit of our wisdom. There's a great deal of reason why we should hang on to wisdom, and that's what a teacher brings. That's what learning design brings into a particular scenario. So I think independent learning for me should empower children. It should give children a voice around their learning. It should have a very strong element of children having to contemplate how they've performed in particular areas, to reflect on the lessons they've learned, things that have gone wrong, how they can adjust it, how they can move things on. That's all important. And I think whatever form you then decide the independent learning should take, if you've got that ability for children to help determine the experiences without massaging the learning outcomes too much, if you've got a system that allows them to measure their progress towards those learning outcomes, and if you've got a process that enables them to reflect and keep pivoting and producing the next draft form of their output and so on and so on and so on, then I think that's a good method. If you were to say to me which is my favourite, without a doubt it would be design thinking. I think really, I've gone through, over the decades, I've gone through many different approaches to independent learning and project-based learning type of pedagogies. But for me, design thinking absolutely knocks everything else out the park and applies to almost every situation that a person is likely to find themselves in. So that's the one that I tend to promote most nowadays. But actually, as I said, it can fit many different forms, and that's the beauty and joy of it.
All right, here is a fun challenge. If you were to explain innovative pedagogy with a metaphor from pop culture, which would you pick? Is it more like the Matrix, a reality bending revelation, or maybe a Harry Potter where everyone has their own magic?
Oh, that's great. Let's go for Harry Potter. I mean, I like Hagrid because he looks and sounds like most of my ancestors. I think, yeah, I think I would say that, largely because, I mean, what was part of the Harry Potter story was many twists and turns over the course of the novels, and you never knew whether the goodies were baddies or the baddies were goodies. You know, Professor Snape, when it all started, was a baddie, but in the end turned out to be a great goodie, and that was never obvious to the child or adults many times as they were reading the books that was the way it was going to go. And I think innovative pedagogy can be like that. You don't always know whether the pedagogy you've chosen is going to work out well or be a complete disaster. So I think be ready for twists and turns and surprises would be my byline. So I'm going to go for Harry Potter.
Perfect. Do you have a story of where you saw this kind of a teaching make a real difference in student life?
Oh, countless stories, actually, countless stories. I mean, to pull one out, it would be, I was working in a great school we were doing some really innovative things and very courageous things, I think. It was in the UK, under the watchful eye of the regulator. We were being quite courageous. And I can remember really clearly, towards the end of my time working with that, it was a cluster of schools, working with one of these particular schools, interviewing a young man who was applying for a job as a teacher. And he'd gone through the school previously as a student.
Okay.
And he was able to describe the process, the impact that it had had on him. And but the killer blow for me in the interview was when he was talking about how he'd met with a friend of his. It was in a very tough bit of London, a super tough bit of London. And he'd met with a friend of his at the gym, and the friend had said, "What are you doing?" And he said, I'm interviewing for a teacher's job tomorrow at our old school." And the guy said, "It's amazing." And he said, "You'd be a great teacher too. You know, you should train to be a teacher." And this guy said, "I couldn't do it." He said, "Yeah, you could. You know, you've got all these qualities and so on." He said, "No, I've got a criminal record, and I wouldn't be accepted." And this guy that I was interviewing said what the school was doing, what my mum did. It started with his mum. He wanted to be a drummer, and his mum, they had absolutely no money. His mum got a set of saucepans and some wooden spoons, and she got a videotape from the local library of one lesson on how to drum, and this little kid was banging away. I don't know what the neighbours thought, banging away on the saucepans, and he late after the end of school one day. He was in one of our schools, and a teacher stumbled upon him, and he just had pencils and bits of stick, and he was flapping them around on a table. And the teacher said, you should have gone home by now. And he hadn't gone home because the gangs in that part of London would all gather at that time, and he waited until they'd moved on to their other naughtiness that they were doing before he went home. And he said, "No, I don't want to go home, because of the gangs." So the teacher said, "So what are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm trying to drum. I've got some saucepans at home. I'm trying to drum." And this teacher said, "Well, we can do a bit better than that." And so the teacher eventually started to help this young man, the young boy as he was then, learn how to drum in different ways. And that stayed with him throughout the whole of his career. But it was because the teacher was able to draw on different forms of drumming and create other groups and match the child's learning experience to where his passions and interests were, that this young man stayed out of any of the gangs. Even when many of his friends fell into the gangs, he stayed out of the gangs. And because of that, he was able to become a teacher. And so he'd come back to this primary school that this journey started in, that I was leading, and said, I want to give back to my community. It changed his life, but more than that, he then went on to change countless of other children's lives because of the experience he'd had in the schools that I was leading. And that has stayed with me as one of the most moving stories. If a teacher or a school leader ever needs it, very often, and if he hadn't applied for a job at the school, I would never have known this story. But very often we have no idea how we're moving and affecting people's lives for good. And I was just fortunate enough that he applied for this job, and I was able to hear that story. Needless to say, we offered him the job on the spot.
Wow, that's amazing. Let's talk about school system redesign. When you approach a school that needs reimagining, then where do you start?
Great question. Where do you start? When I was in the UK, I was a national leader of education. I worked with hundreds of schools. The regulator had decided they were all in trouble, and they were all going down the drain. And very often they weren't. But what I discovered, when you go into a lot of schools, I think you can tell within about 30 seconds the health of the school. You can almost taste it as you go in. It's just little things, the kind of welcome you get at reception, the care and attention that there is in that foyer, the distant sounds that you can hear echoing around the place. You just get that sense of, it's one of those schools, and you can sense it. But whatever journey that the school is trying to go on, I think there are two questions there. One is about system redesign. That's much more complex. So I spent a lot of time working with government in the UK on system redesign, and that's a very tough task. As much as we all sit here as on the receiving end of government policy of how schools should be run around the world, try being government. It's not easy. You've got thousands of schools, and you have very little influence in being able to inspire and uplift or even monitor what's happening. You're almost driven down a metric measurement system. And the best way to kill the spirit of anything is just to measure the metrics. You completely lose the point of the spirit of the endeavour. But I think it's very difficult for governments to find other ways to do it. Finland, as I was saying, has found another way. They've got rid of all of that kind of germ model, as Pasi Solberg calls it, and have said, look, we're not going to do that. That's not helping improvement. We're going to foster collaboration between the schools, and we're going to get rid of comparison. We're going to get rid of examination models until the very end of things. And it's proved to be very successful. Finland consistently performing in the top 5 of jurisdictions globally, and the only European country to do so. Mostly it's dominated by Singapore, Shanghai, South Korea, and so on, and increasingly the UAE. But actually Finland occupies this rare spot within that without any kind of regulatory hard-nosed attitude. So I think system redesign is very, very difficult for governments, and it requires a lot of courage. And in most democracies, governments don't have the courage for that because the political cycle is so short. If you're going to have system redesign which covers millions of children across thousands of schools, then that's not something you can bring about overnight. You've got to have investments over years to that. And that means all of society has to have investment, because you have to support either this government or a successive government in still carrying on with the same initiative. So system redesign is super hard, I think. School redesign is a lot easier. You control many of the attributes and variables that you need to think of. But in terms of being able to tell whether the school has got a bit of a problem or not, I think you can taste that very quickly. But how you get them to the solution is very much more difficult, because I think the last thing that anyone should do when they're trying to redesign a school is come in and say, well, I've got a great idea because it works over there. Well, great, but over there is over there, and now you're over here. And so that thing that worked brilliantly over there with that community, with those people, with that staff, with that history, with that fee point, etc., that's completely different to over here, where we've got different people and different fee points and different curriculum maybe, and so on. So I think it's important in school redesign not to think that one size fits all. One size very definitely never fits all. And so what that means is you have to start by listening, and you have to, if you're a school leader, you have to be listening to what your school is telling you. And the school is made up of many different things. Obviously the students, obviously the parents, obviously the staff, also the broader community, also the jurisdiction and any regulatory framework that impacts that, also the curriculum you're running. There are many different voices that play into that. The historic experience that the school has had, as well as its future ambition. So I think when you're trying to redesign it, it starts with listening. Listen really well. And when you think you've done listening, listen some more so that you can start to understand it. And then move into collaboration. Your job, if you're a senior person or a consultant or a leader there, is to provoke some questions that move the thinking along. But really, in reality, if you don't take a significant cohort of people with you, you will never be able to redesign the school anyway. It comes back to John Cotter's model and every change management book that you can think of, which is really talking about you have to establish the urgency for change. And once you've established that urgency for change, you've got to get some early adopters. But you need to recognize in that bell curve of early adopters, the 2%, which are the early adopters, 1%, so half of that 2% are all nutcases. They're all people that have been waiting for the revolution forever. Yeah. And you say, oh, right, let's have a revolution. And they go charging away in some uncontrolled manner. So you've got to be very discerning about that first set of people, because some of them aren't going to take you where you intended to be. You're looking for that other half of the 1%. Who actually are ready for change, are keen, enthusiastic, but are super smart and super sensible. That's the key group. And if you can get them and combine them, or maybe they already are people of influence within the community, then you get the next 15%. After you've got that, then you get yourself up to 50%. And then, of course, you get the back half of that. You get another 40% coming on board. The school is on its way.
And what role do new technology play in your vision?
Well, I think if you'd asked me 25 years ago, I would have said, oh, it's significantly important. I can remember, again, in my first headship, teaching the primary children there how to touch type. We got shoe boxes that we put over the computer keyboards. We didn't have a computer suite. Not many schools did, 1,000 years ago. And not many schools did. So we borrowed people's computers from home that they were moving on and they were upgrading something else, and they would give their old computer to us. So our computer, I can remember now, our computer suite were really odd looking, because all the computers were different shapes and sizes and various different versions of yellow or white or grey. So it's a real mishmash of stuff. But it was revolutionary. People didn't have this kind of facility, and we were getting our children to do some exciting things. One of the exciting things was to teach them to touch type. And I can remember one little girl, Esme her name was, and she was in year 3, so she was only 7 years old. She was about 80 words per minute. She was incredible. And they couldn't see, of course, they put their hands in the shoebox, so they couldn't see where the letters were on the keyboard. They had to look at the screen, and she was banging it out. Absolutely amazing. And I looked at her and the other children, and I thought, I've given you a gift for life. You're going to thank me. I'm going to be, when you're at that conference and someone says, remember that teacher, you're going to say, Neil Hopkin, because he taught me how to touch type and it's changed everything. Yeah. But, the truth was, of course, very quickly, it turned out we didn't need to type at all. I mean, people can hardly handwrite anymore. If you try to write something, you look at your writing and it's hardly legible. Why? Because you spend most of the time either doing this, or more likely doing this, and increasingly nowadays just doing that and just talking, and the whole thing gets transcribed for you. You don't need to write or type. You certainly don't need to touch type. And so if I go back to that time and you'd said how important is technology, new technology to your vision, I would have said critically important.
At Fortis Education, you're working at strategic level to drive improvement. How do you ensure these big pictures impact the everyday experiences of teachers and students?
That's a really good question. I mean, strategic change is something that's really important in any organisation, schools or otherwise. I think a large part of it is to make sure that it's Jim Collins, really, isn't it? You know, everybody's got to be, they've got to be on the right bus. They've got to be on the right seat on the right bus as well. Yeah. And so it's recognizing strengths and weaknesses and what do you as an individual bring to the endeavor to move forward. I think, as we were saying before, the John Cotter's notion of change management and establishing an urgent need to change is important. And that is a two-way street. And so sometimes senior people within an organization will have decided that change needs to be made for some reason. Some strategic direction, new strategic direction needs to be pursued on the one hand. On the other hand, they need to communicate that and get people to buy into that. That's establishing the urgency. If you look at the other side of the road, people that are at the chalk face, the people that are in the classroom, that are teaching the children, that are meeting the parents, that are experiencing the difficulty with a new influx of people with a particular need, or whatever it might be, they can see an urgent need for change, but senior management within the organisation doesn't even know about it. And so you've got to have systems that enable that communication to go up there and to get senior managers to buy into, we're going to need to make some change and probably some expenditure around that. So I think one of the most important things around strategic change is, first of all, is the importance of communication. And having communication in both directions, and then attaching that to a vision, not the vacuous vision that appears on corporate headlines and that kind of stuff, but actually everybody understanding a question that I ask every week: what are we trying to achieve? And that people can actually gravitate around what is it that we're trying to achieve with this. And I think with many innovations that you put in place, as they roll along through their development cycle, very often people can forget what they were trying to achieve. You become so obsessed with the latest nuance or that problem that you need to overcome in this innovation that you forget what started you on this journey in the first place. And you end up presenting a product for your organization to use in its innovative way, and it's solving a problem that nobody was ever asking about because you lost track of what started you on that. So I think it's critically important to keep that communication alive and vibrant up and down your organization or from side to side of your organization, and always keep reflecting back on what we're trying to achieve. It doesn't matter if the innovation needs to change along the route. I think what matters if that happens, if the route changes without anybody deliberately and consciously deciding to make that change, and it just sort of organically morphs into something which isn't really addressing the problem.
As someone with big ideas, how do you balance your aspirations with the practicalities of day-to-day school life?
Schools are people organizations. They're staffed by people. There's got a very high ratio of staff member to customer, if you call the child the customer, much higher than almost any other organization. And actually, the product that they're working on is a person. It's a child. And more than just a child, it's the child's future. You're working on nurturing a fantastic future for that child and trying to put all the building blocks in place for them to be able to use long after they've left you. So I think balancing all these ambitions and aspirations against that understanding of what you're doing is you're working with people, for people, is really important. So it's about remembering, especially when you're in a jurisdiction that is regulated, it's about remembering that this whole endeavor is humanitarian. It's got humans right at the core of it, and it's got the future of those people right at the core of it in all sorts of ways, not just their own future, but how they will go on to improve the lives of others. If you give them the right ingredients and the right building blocks, they will become the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the philanthropists that will actually have an impact on people that are struggling to help themselves for various reasons. And if you don't put those ingredients in and you don't get that nurture and that outward-facing look, they won't do that, and the world will be a much poorer and sadder place because of it. So I think if you can remember that our core vision here is to work forward, and we say at Fortis Education, we're striving to nurture change makers to create a better tomorrow. And I think, in many ways, the brightness of that tomorrow is terrifically significant, but it comes from being a human-based, humanitarian, loving, mission-driven school.
And Dr. Hopkin, if you have to pick any one subject and you have to teach one lesson in a week, so what would that subject be? Well,
my dad was my physics teacher, so he would have wanted to have heard me say physics, but it wouldn't be physics. It would be English, I think. I think I would a little bit like the film Dead Poets Society, if you've seen that film, then just trying to help children understand the wonderful imagery and passions of literature. That's, if I had to teach something forever, it would be that, probably.
Okay, now let's move on to our next round, which is called rapid fire round.
Okay,
so
I'm
you
ready.
have to answer
I'm
whatever
ready.
comes in your mind first. You're always ready.
I'll try.
Favorite subject in school?
Favorite subject in school? I quite like music, but I didn't like the music teacher. Maths. I loved maths.
Okay.
Yeah.
One book every educator should read?
Negotiated Learning by Garth Boomer. He's an Australian author. It's a fantastic textbook, largely secondary, but you can apply it to primary, all about how to engage with children and create a co-curriculum together.
Your best school snack?
Best snack. I mean, if my wife wasn't watching, it would definitely be chocolate based. But most schools don't allow chocolate in their snacks. So what would I go for? Do you know? I quite like jackfruit. That bright yellow, quite odd sort of flavoured thing. I quite like it. Or dates, actually. I really love a good date, as long as it's a good date.
You are in Dubai, so definitely.
Exactly, surrounded by great
dates.
Yeah.
One sweeping change in all schools tomorrow.
That's great. I mean, obviously, you would say something around sort of empathy, connecting with other people, more compassion, etc. I think the world needs that. But actually, probably pragmatically, a lot more sport. I think we've got a juggernaut of obesity and health issues that are occurring, especially within the Western Hemisphere. I think if I was going to have a sweeping change, I would have a lot more children moving. The other thing, sweeping change, I would look at Finland, and I would look at what have they done, getting rid of exams and still performing so highly in PISA and TIMSS. So I don't know. I'm on in terms of children's health, probably a lot more activity. I think that's increasingly important in our lifestyle nowadays. But if I was just thinking about education, look to Finland, get rid of the exams, monitor that carefully because it could be a disaster, and see what's made Finland so great and try and adopt that in a few other countries.
If you were not in education, what profession would you have chosen?
Well, if I could run my life again, I would be a fashion designer.
Okay.
My wife indulges me and she lets me choose all of her clothes. She hasn't bought any clothes for years now. I absolutely love women's fashion. I'd love to be a fashion designer. I remarked on your jacket when I came in just a little while ago. If not that, ironically, I'd love to be a hairdresser. I mean, basically, I'm a creative. I love the performing arts. I used to run a children's opera company. But if I had a free choice, I'd be Versace. It'd be brilliant.
That was an incredible rapid fire round. Thank you so much for being a sport.
Thank you.
Looking forward, where do you see education heading in the next decade?
It's going AI. And I think it's fascinating because it's going to create problems. If you're in a school and you're doing chalk and talk teaching, very didactic models, AI is going to come and eat your breakfast. We don't need you if that's what you do. That said, we're just at the start of the AI curve, and there are a lot of things we don't understand about it. As with most new things, it all looks shiny when you get it out the box, and we're going to discover in time that there are dangers, there are unintended consequences. Just in the same way that I think we're going to look at social media and think that it was probably the worst thing we did as humanity in terms of compassion and connecting with people. I think we're going to look at AI and regret that we let the genie out the bottle. But the genie is out of the bottle. There's no getting it back in. So in terms of education, we've got to be on top of that. And we're going to need to manage very carefully how it's introduced and what the unintended consequences are, and try and avoid some of those if we can. So it's definitely AI is going to change everything. I mean, it's already changed many things, but increasingly it's going to change the face of education, and schools are going to have to perform much better in terms of understanding how to think and innovate. Because we don't have a great history of innovation within education. If you list the various different professions in order of innovative capability, education is second to last. The only thing around the world that is worse at innovating than education is government. Now, that's not true in Dubai. We have a very innovative government. But in almost every other country, government is the worst and education is the next. And why is that? They move extremely slowly. It's almost glacial, the pace of change. Whereas if you look in the tech industry, it's bam, bam, bam. And so education, unfortunately, AI isn't now just about what I was doing in my first headship, which is introducing computers and teaching kids to touch type. AI is actually changing enormously what educators could be capable of doing, and certainly what every other profession is doing. And so if education doesn't get on board with that, we're preparing kids and they're not going to be able to actually be useful to industry. And so what's the point of education if it's not that, in many respects? And so I think schools are going to have to look at their innovative direction and policy and think very hard about how they're going to keep up the pace of change and deep thought and safeguarding and guardrails around AI.
One last question before we wrap up. What's one piece of advice you think teachers would actually laugh at and remember?
Be a child. Be a child. If you can stay in touch with the childlike instinct that you have within yourself, you are like the Pied Piper. You're a magician in children's imagination, whether they're young or old, whether they're postgrads or little early years kindergarten children. Stay in touch with that childish spirit, laugh a lot, have a lot of fun, be transparent and welcoming and warm. Be that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neil Hopkin. Thank you for your time today.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thanks.
Dr. Hopkin, before we wrap up, I want to acknowledge the incredible impact you have had on education. Your work goes beyond just innovative ideas. You are truly dedicated to endorsing and empowering people. You are helping educators and students alike rise to their full potential, reshaping schools, and more importantly, shaping futures. We are lucky to have you in this field. Dr. Hopkin, this has been an enlightening conversation. Your insights into educational leadership, innovation, and future of teaching have truly inspired us all. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and for sharing your remarkable journey with our listeners. For those tuning in, we hope you have gained as much inspiration from Dr. Hopkin as we have. Remember, the future of education is in our hand and the leaders like Dr. Neil Hopkin guiding the way. It's certainly an exciting one. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep shaping the future of education. To everyone listening, thank you for tuning in to Think-N-Innovate. We'll catch you in the next time. Stay curious and stay creative.